Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Black Radical, the Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. My name is Kaylon Taylor-Clark, and I'm a proud member of the class of 1999 and a medical school grad from 2001. I'm also currently serving on the Board of Trustees, so I'm very, very excited to be here today. Although we cannot gather in person, I'm very pleased to welcome over 200 people to this talk today. Alums, parents, and friends of Tufts to this event from around the globe as part of Virtual Reunion Week, which features alumni panels, faculty lectures like this one, and several fun events for jumbos of all ages to enjoy. To see the full schedule of events, please visit alumniandfriends.tufts.edu. It's still early in the week and there's still time to register for more events, so we do hope you'll sign up. Before I introduce Professor Greenidge, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First, you'll notice your audio and video has been turned off to eliminate any distraction and disruption from background noise. We'll have an audience Q&A session after the presentation, and if you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A chat function that's on the lower right portion of your screen. This webinar is also going to be recorded and will be uploaded to the Tufts Alumni YouTube channel. Marianne will post the link to that page and you'll receive an email when the video is ready for your viewing. And in fact, you can see it in the chat now, I believe. You'll notice also that closed captioning is on. If you'd like to turn this feature off, click the live transcript at the bottom of your screen and click on hide subtitles. Lastly, I'd like to call attention to our community values. Our goal is to create an environment where everyone feels welcome to participate, ask questions, and participate in respectful conversations. Marianne is going to post those values now. You can see them in the chat. So now, I'm pleased to introduce and moderate this, our first faculty webinar of the week with Professor Carrie Greenidge, the Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Professor in the Department of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora Studies, and Interim Director of the American Studies Program. Dr. Greenidge received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and the New Republic, among other publications. She's also co-director of the African American Trail Project through Tufts Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Today, Professor Greenidge will discuss her latest book, Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, excuse me. The book has won numerous awards, including the Massachusetts Book Award, the J. Anthony Lukas Award, and the Gomes Award from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Black Radical was also listed as New York Times notable book for 2019. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Carrie Greenidge. Dr. Greenidge, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's involved in the Alumni Week and the Union Week and all of the alumni and students and parents who are involved. So thank you very much. I'm going to read a little bit about the book, show some slides, and then I will be happy to hear your questions. So in December 1919, Henrietta Vinton Davis, an organizer for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, invoked the name of Boston editor William Monroe Trotter. She was speaking before a crowd in Kingston, Jamaica, and the occasion was a rally for Garvey's Black Star Line, the shipping company operated by the UNIA to support a global Pan-African economy. As UNIA field organizer, Davis was responsible for getting Garvey's mostly working class followers to purchase stock in the Black Star Line, an often daunting task given the economic realities of post-war Black life. To galvanize the crowd in Kingston then, Davis linked the UNIA's demand for Pan-African self-determination to two Black figures whose folk hero status inspired Black crowds across the African diaspora. Frederick Douglass, the most famous ex-slave of the previous century, and William Monroe Trotter, the Phi Beta Kappa Harvard graduate who recently presented the demands of the colored people for world democracy at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. As Henrietta Davis told the crowd, the BSL's SS Frederick Douglass, seen here in the photograph, was actually the SS Yarmouth, the same ship that Trotter took to France despite being denied a federal passport. When the Kingston audience heard this, as Davis dramatically waved a copy of Trotter's Boston Guardian newspaper for emphasis, the crowd exploded in raucous cheers and applause. The Boston editor's radicalism was so respected, Davis told the UNIA in her report of the incident, that stock purchases surged across Jamaica at the mere implication of Trotter's connection to the Black Star Line. Davis and Garvey were not the only so-called new Negroes, the term of the time, used to invoke William Monroe Trotter and the Guardian in their populist calls for transnational Black radicalism. 2 years later, in 1921, Black men in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, referenced Trotter, the Guardian, and Black Boston in their armed defense against white racial violence. From May 31st to June 1st, 1921, whites in Tulsa burned Greenwood, seen here, to the ground, forcing over 10,000 Black men, women, and children to flee their homes. Known as the Negro Wall Street, Greenwood was the wealthiest all-Black city in America, where Black migrants built their own investment firms, hospitals, newspapers, and small businesses. By the time of the Tulsa massacre, Blacks in Greenwood survived the economic recession that roiled post-war northeastern Oklahoma, more financially stable than some predominantly white towns. By the end of the massacre, however, Greenwood was completely destroyed by what turned out to be a coordinated attack by government officials, Tulsa's white business leaders, and the state militia. As their families fled and their neighborhood collapsed, members of the Tulsa branch of the African Blood Brotherhood shot back at white mobs and police cars. When white pundits in the New York Times and the Washington Star accused the Brotherhood of, quote, wanton attacks on the white race, end quote, an ABB member retorted, quote, certainly the Negro heroes who fought to the death at Tulsa in defense of Negro honor and manhood and the helpless women and children behind the lines have gained Valhalla and have been recognized fit inmates for whatever paradise exists on the other side. We owe a debt of gratitude to Trotter of Boston for showing us the way. As to the accusation that the Tulsa Post of the African Blood Brotherhood fomented and directed the Tulsa riot, he concluded, the first part is a lie, and whether we directed the Negroes in their fight in self-defense is certainly no crime in Negro eyes and is left for the white Oklahoma authorities. For ourselves, we neither deny it nor affirm it. Although the ABB, African Blood Brotherhood, could not save Greenwood, it inspired Black radical political consciousness across the African diaspora in its call for, quote, armed self-defense for the colored peoples of the world in the spirit of Toussaint, Hannibal, and Placido of old, end quote. Founded in 1919 by Trotter and Caribbean radicals in Harlem, including the father of the New Negro movement, Hubert Harrison, the St. Nevis-born Marxist Cyril V. Briggs, and socialist communist activist Grace Campbell, the African Blood Brotherhood used the violence of Red Summer, the failure of the Great War to address, quote, the anti-colonial impulse of the darker world, and the racialized rhetoric of self-determination embodied in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points to argue for Black radical liberation on terms dictated and directed by what they referred to as colored people themselves. Organized through the Guardian, Harrison's Crusader, and Garvey's New Negro World newspapers, the ABB agreed spread to Black communities from Tulsa to Bridgetown, and it established armed Black self-defense as the nucleus around which all future liberation struggles evolved. The African Blood Brotherhood, like Garvey's Black Star Line and Trotter's Radical Liberty League, did not survive the 1920s. And William Monroe Trotter, seen here, did not survive the historical narrative that relegates him, his newspaper, and Boston to footnotes in the story of transnational Black radical politics at the beginning of the last century. Indeed, most scholarship on African diaspora politics and Black radical political consciousness give Trotter a minimal role in American civil rights, while ignoring the diasporic and transnational significance of his politics. So who was William Monroe Trotter? Why was he alone among contemporaries in protesting unapologetically, persistently, and radically against racial conservatism and white liberal apathy in the face of radical Reconstruction's betrayal at the turn of the last century? Most importantly, how does his use of the Guardian to foment grassroots radical Black politics demand scholarly reconceptualizations of the Black press, Black political independence, and the possibilities of Black community activism during the period that historians refer to as the, quote, long nadir at the turn of the last century. Here he is again, Hubert Harrison, C.L. Briggs. William Monroe Trotter was born in 1872, the year that liberal Republicans broke from their radical colleagues to oppose federal enforcement of the Reconstruction Amendments. He died exactly 62 years later as Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt presided over an administration that fundamentally changed the relationship between federal policy and the American economy. Bookended as he was between the failed promise of radical Reconstruction and the racial limitations of New Deal liberalism, William Monroe Trotter's life represents the radical possibilities of Northern Black politics rooted in transnational Black radicalism. Trotter's life also reconceptualizes Black radicalism as a tradition that thrived and existed outside of the rural South, in the urban, predominantly white Northeast, amongst an ethnically and culturally diverse Black community. William Monroe Trotter used The Guardian to, as he stated it, hold a mirror up to nature, again taken from Shakespeare, by using powerful text, imagery, cartoons, and editorials to reinvigorate Black-led radical demands for racial justice, defined, dictated, and directed by what he referred to as the colored people themselves. He held up this mirror on a Black Boston community that was inherently transnational and radical in its politics. In a region, New England, where nearly 20% of the Black community was foreign-born, mostly in the Caribbean, Cape Verde, and South America, Trotter envisioned what he called a colored world democracy that conceptualized Blackness as inherently diasporic and Negroness as what he called the colored peoples of the world. As the Caribbean leader Richard B. Moore noted, it was Trotter who coined the term colored to define Black people. According to The Guardian, color was the only term that adequately accounted for the various nationalities, skin colors, and mixed racial backgrounds of African-descended people in a city where a fifth of those defined as Black were born outside the country, and nearly 2/3 were listed as mulatto or mixed race. Because Trotter used The Guardian to galvanize transnational Black radicalism rooted in the notion that Blackness itself was diasporic in nature, his political independence and militant calls for racial self-determination inspired the genteel poor, the majority of African-descended people in Greater Boston and in northern cities across the country, who rejected the Washington Du Bois dialectic already developing in progressive America's racial consciousness. These genteel poor, alienated from the self-professed race men and race women who claimed to represent the interests of the Negro, understood the devastation wrought by Reconstruction's bloody collapse, Southern disfranchisement, and violent segregation. The Guardian spoke to these people, and the people, in turn, helped transform The Guardian into a cultural and political institution through which, as Trotter said, the colored people themselves, with Trotter as their coach, defined racial justice on their own radical international terms. Monroe Trotter used The Guardian as a grassroots organizing tool long before the term reached social movement consciousness, and long before, of course, we have Twitter and social media today. This grassroots political organization created a movement toward political independence that affected Boston's political landscape and eventually inspired what white political commentators called the New England example. Black voters in the 1890s through the 1930s exercising their dissatisfaction with the GOP to vote for populist Democratic candidates. So I first heard about William Monroe Trotter from my grandfather, Samuel Lee Dance. Here's Trotter again. Samuel Lee Dance, my grandfather, was a proud Black veteran of World War II, raised in Petersburg, Virginia, who was intensely political despite the fact that he lacked a high school education. He and my grandmother were activists in the mold of Howard Thurman, whose Jesus and the Disinherited sat on their bookshelf beside a copy of The Souls of Black Folk. My grandparents were amongst the first African Americans to purchase a house in Arlington, Massachusetts during the 1950s, although they spent their lives involved in civil rights work around Greater Boston and New England. It was from them that I learned to look for Black stories beyond the existing scholarship, in supposedly predominantly white spaces like New England and Boston and Medford, as well as distinctly African places like the Mississippi Delta and Haiti. Often my grandfather would pile me, my sisters, my cousins, and any neighborhood kid who happened to be hanging around into his silver Cadillac. We would drive up and down Route 2, west on I-90 or south on I-93, and he would point out places that seemed insignificant. Downtown New Bedford, the fishing shacks on Plum Island, or the woods around Great Barrington and Mount Greylock, where, he said, Black people and Native people set their footprints. He was the first to tell me about slavery in Medford, Cape Verdean labor organizers in Dartmouth, and Black sleeping car porters in the south end of Boston. And he was the first to tell me about Trotter. I remember I was homesick and I was lying on the couch in his living room while he cleaned up from lunch and watched a midday local news program. The program was a retrospective on the 10th anniversary of anti-busing riots in South Boston, with images of white people throwing bricks and hurling the N-word at Black children in Roxbury, some of whom my grandparents knew. And I remember my grandfather saying out loud to nobody in particular, none of that would have happened if Trotter were here. When my grandmother came home, I asked her who Trotter was, and she took me in her lap and wrote his name on a piece of paper. She and my grandfather told me that Trotter was, quote, a race man, like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. And my grandmother showed me a copy of Stephen R. Fox's 1979 biography, The Guardian of Boston. When I grew up, I found that book in a used bookstore, bought it for $5, and read it cover to cover in one weekend, convinced, like my grandparents, that Black stories are always far more complex than we believe, and that stories like Trotter's ought to be as analyzed, discussed, and studied as Du Bois, Garvey, King, and Malcolm X. It has been my hope with Black Radical to reorient the scholarship toward these stories, not as a form of hagiography or racial exceptionalism, but as a way to challenge ourselves to more completely reckon with our racial history. On the importance of biography and community stories in African American and American studies scholarship, I will end with a quote by the great historian Nell Irvin Painter. She says, "Beyond the most finely tuned categories lies something exceeding race, class, and gender, individual subjectivity. I remain convinced," Nell Painter says, "that historians should keep in sight the fundamental lessons of psychology and psychoanalysis, that all people, even people who describe themselves primarily as raced or gendered, are individuals, that individual subjects develop within families, that families need not be related biologically, that attachment does not necessarily connote positive feeling, that attachment and grief do not stop at social barriers of color or class. Families at every economic level inculcate the finest and basest of values." Thank you. And I look forward to questions.
Dr. Greenidge, that was amazing. Are we back? Can folks see us and hear us, Marianne?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Greenidge, for that. You know, I wanted to actually ask you just as a start, and because I'm really unaware, that was a fascinating history and understanding of the influence of Trotter. And I'm just curious as to whether there is a contemporary sort of media institution that serves the public or specific populaces in similar ways as The Guardian did. If you see that now, or is it coming up in some other spaces?
So excellent question. I would say that I don't see something that functions in the same way that The Guardian functioned, but I don't think that's necessarily like something that's causing people to reminisce about the olden days. I think what we have now is a media landscape in which there are lots of options for people to post and discuss, which is a good thing. And Trotter would have liked that. And The Guardian was very big on that. So The Guardian was a newspaper that had Black people, all people writing into the to what we now call the comment section, and he would respond to each one on the page. So I think that we should see Trotter and The Guardian as an influence on the ways in which we can now use media, newspapers, Twitter, what have you, to highlight certain voices that are not heard. I also think that we can also see the value in what newspapers and newspaper cultures can do for communities. that have been historically disenfranchised or marginalized. The fact that the Guardian reached, Cape Verde, there's evidence it was published in the Bahamas and in Barbados and in Boston and New York, right? Gives us a notion of the power of the press, however it's defined, whether it's defined now in terms of Twitter or electronically or in terms of print, the power of the press to really create a political consciousness amongst its readers.
Great, that's really helpful. Actually, we got a first question in from Emily Woodward. You mentioned Du Bois as a contemporary of Trotter's who's been examined and studied more comprehensively over time. What was their relationship like? Were they rivals? Were they collaborators?
So thank you for that question, Emily. In the book, I go into the relationship between the two men pretty in depth. They were both New Englanders. They both attended Harvard at the same time. So Trotter graduated from his undergraduate at Harvard in 1895. Du Bois received his PhD that same year. And they were friends. So I have a whole section in the book where I talk about the Black community of college students who attended Harvard and Brown and Boston University and Tufts in the 1890s and sort of form this community around each other. So they were friendly with one another. Du Bois was courting the woman who eventually became Trotter's wife, Geraldine Pindell. So Du Bois, that was the woman he wanted to marry, and Trotter married him. But they remained very, very close. And Du Bois, when he came to Boston in the early 1900s, the house he stayed in was Trotter's home in Dorchester. The difference between the two was that really came in terms of their politics. We forget that Du Bois in the early part of his career, roughly until about 1920, was pretty much a moderate, would have been considered a civil rights moderate. He wrote and he published The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP. The NAACP was a moderate civil rights organization that Trotter had issues with, and that many working class Black people had issues with because of, they believed that it had failure to address the immediate needs of the community. And so they separated definitely ideologically along those lines. But I always point out, and one of the ways I end the book is that when Trotter died in 1934, Du Bois got the telegram the morning after. The morning of, excuse me, and he immediately suspended production on The Crisis to put Trotter's picture on the cover, and basically then had his own plans to write a biography of Trotter. And one of his statements about Trotter was that he was a polarizing figure, he was a galvanizing figure, but nearly every Black person Du Bois knew read The Guardian, and that Du Bois said he couldn't even say that about The Crisis, right? That he was that big of a force kind of in Black communities themselves. So sort of a contentious relationship, definitely ideologically were not aligned during part of their life, but definitely had this sort of lifelong affection and respect for one another.
That's fascinating. One of the things that's come up is just how long it took you to comprise all of this research. This is just out of curiosity. How long does this kind of research take you to both compile and then write up and then be able to transmit in this way?
Oh, so it's a good question. So Trotter was a chapter in my dissertation. And so I began that work then, but I would say between the dissertation and the book, that was about 7 years. Before, when I was in graduate school, I began to collect pieces of The Guardian. I can personally say I've read every single issue of The Guardian that currently exists in the country, because I would spend sort of all the time just going through all of those things, all of the issues. So it took me about 7 years to write, but it really was a book that I wanted to be told in a certain way. And so it was hard to get publishers until I found my wonderful publisher at Norton to kind of see the book in the way that I thought of it, look at biography as a way to illustrate a time and a place. And do that through Trotter's life as opposed to merely looking at the life itself. So it took a while.
Well, and I like the idea that you say looking at biography as a time and a place as opposed to an individual, right? And really being able to provide a context for what's happening around an individual. And that's really what I imagine is being brought to light in this book. And so really appreciate that and wonder, what are you working on next? And so how are you then translating this idea of biography? Are you going that route, or are you going elsewhere in terms of your research?
Yeah, so I'm doing a similar thing, albeit it's a lot more people. So I'm doing another biography, but it's a biography of a family of white people and Black people who were related through enslavement in the South. And so the book really explores how that created the politics of both sides of the family, the politics of the white slaveholders who eventually became abolitionists, and the Black people who were descendants of their slaves who became politicians and activists at the turn of the century. So similar idea. I really wanted to get into the lives of people and use that to illustrate how it is that then people develop their political outlook and their political way of being in the world.
Wonderful. That is incredibly interesting. One thing that did come up is that somebody said it sounds like it will be a great film adaptation. So you never know. You might be selling the rights to the next William Trotter movie here, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. One of the questions that also comes up is sort of, what are the biggest challenges you face in doing research like this in terms of the history? I mean, you have to obviously go to a lot of original texts, I imagine, that aren't necessarily online, but what is that process, and what are some of the biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenge is finding all the sources are out there, but because of the way that archival and archives are held, being able to really find what I'm looking for in multiple archives. So usually if I were writing about somebody who was not African-American, or in the case of my new book, women, it's much easier to go into an archive and sort of find their letters and find their writings. It's much harder to go in and find letters and writings of the people I want to write about. And so it's really a matter of working with the archive, going into and delving into, universities, personal papers, other people's papers, and going kind of a circuitous route to get access to primary source material. I always tell my students, that primary source material is where you should begin to do your work, and then you kind of pull out from there. And so for the people in the time period I write about, it's very difficult to get into the archive, but it's getting easier. During COVID, I've been singing the praises of librarians and people who work in research institutions who, despite the fact that we can't go physically, have been very, very good at giving access to photocopies and scanning of the material. So I would say that's probably the hardest part. The second thing I would say is that trying to do honor to the people I'm writing about without reducing them to a problem,
Right.
not reducing them to seeing them through the lens of how we would see them in 2021. And so that was definitely a challenge in the Trotter book. I point out throughout the book, one of the themes of the book is that Trotter was a difficult person and was somebody who was a misogynist. So how did that play into his politics, the way he saw things? Similarly, in my new book, how do I talk about the strengths of this family that managed to navigate sort of the racial politics of the time, at the same time acknowledging the difficult relationship they had just as being a multiracial family in America in like the 1890s. So really being careful that I'm using the terms that the people at the time would use, not what I would think they should use or how I think they should talk about themselves, and really doing honor to what it is that they say about themselves.
Well, and that actually gets to a very good point about how the language that's used in a contemporary moment versus, historically. And, we think about when African American as a term was introduced by Jesse Jackson, I believe, in the 80s to describe something. And you mentioned that Trotter, for example, coined the term colored. How do you think that affects his place in history or his legacy in terms of having not only coined that, but then how that then goes into the vernacular of the contemporary history?
Yeah, I think one of the things one of the things I also tell my students is that if we're to say that race is historically contingent, right? And that it's a construct, then we really have to mean what we say by that. And so that would mean that even Black people themselves have ways of defining themselves in the 1890s that are different than today. So for instance, Trotter was very, because he grew up in Boston, which then as now, which I don't think people kind of recognize, is that Boston and Greater Boston has one of the highest rates of Black people born outside of the United States who are classified as African-American in New England. So what does that then do to how people look at race if you were raised, say, in Cape Verde or Barbados or Jamaica or Canada, right? Where race is looked at slightly differently, right? You're going to have a different way of talking about yourself and your community. And so Trotter, because he grew up in that, with that idea, he himself was very big on, well, I can't call them Afro-Americans, which was actually a term that came out after the Civil War, because not all of the people are from Africa, right? I can't call them Negro, which was another popular term, because many people are of a different skin shade. His wife, for instance, was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, but was very proudly Black. You know, he would say, well, I have to use this term. So to him, it was a term of embracing the diversity and of Black people themselves. You know, and Annette Gordon-Reed, the historian, has a great book that just came out called On Juneteenth, and she talks all about this in the book, you know, allowing room for what she calls the buoyancy and complexities of Blackness itself, right? And so I try to do, I think that it's often hard for contemporary people to read some of the older stuff because we're reading it through the lens of, you know, policing the terms that Black people were using for themselves. Whereas if you kind of look at the origins of those terms, it can say a lot about the way that person was thinking of themselves and their community and politics and the world generally.
Interesting. I was just curious, do you have students involved in your research? Do you bring in students? How are they receiving the work and the like?
Well, I love Tufts students because one of the projects that is connected to my own research, but is kind of like a side project that I really want students to leave Tufts with, is that the African American Trail Project. So myself and my colleague, Dr. Kendra Field, fabulous historian, she is in the history department here. She and I started this project based on the work of a beloved professor named Gerald Gill, who passed away in 2007. And he, on Tufts campus, would do something he called the Tufts Freedom Trail, which was just highlighting Black students and Black professors and Black history on Tufts campus. And so we took that a step forward and decided to connect Tufts to all of these public history sites around Massachusetts that cover and discuss the African diaspora and also Afro-Native communities in the area. So we have presently on our map over 352 sites, ranging from the 1600s all the way up to the present. And so in terms of students, I really Kendra and I co-teach a course called Black and Native New England. And one of the things the students do in that class is that they help us find and research additional sites. And they go into the archive. Before COVID times, we take them on field trips, so they get to go to the Royal House and Slave Quarters, which is about 2 blocks away from Tufts. They get to go to the Concord, where there's something called the Robbins House, where there was a strong Black community in the 19th century. They go to New Bedford. And so the ways in which students influence my research is that they really influence and keep me grounded in keeping producing the type of scholarship that people in the public can read as well as academics.
Interesting and very important, right?
Yeah, very
to
important.
Make it consumable is incredibly important because that's how we actually do the teaching. I have a question directly from the chat, which is, I was a student, this is not myself, although I was also, a student of the late Tufts professor Gerald Gill in the 90s. Yes. Dearly missed, and he profoundly influenced not just this person, but myself and many others to always take time to delve into, as you put it, Black stories and women's stories and Indigenous and immigrant stories as well, hiding in plain sight all around us under the radar. Did you have a particular mentor or professor who inspired your approach to this scholarship?
Oh, that's a good question. And yes, Gerald Gill, like I say, the African American Trail Project is a direct result of Gerald Gill's work. His papers are now wonderfully at Tufts, and I urge all my colleagues in the profession, like academics, to use that. Tufts has that, which is a very, like one of the most, I would say one of the most valuable archives in terms of Black New England history that the country has. So wonderful. I unfortunately never got to meet Gerald Gill, but he's definitely, I'm sort of following in his footsteps in terms of my own research and interest. In terms of myself, in graduate school, I was fortunate enough to study under Nina Silber, who was a female scholar of the Civil War, and Jean Jarrett, who is now a dean at NYU, but at the time was a professor of English and African American studies at BU when I was there. Both of those scholars, just in my own training, helped me a lot. But I really think it was growing up, as I said in the talk, with my grandparents, who were very big on looking at stories of Black people. And they were phenomenally good at archiving things, which I now realize they were doing, which is, you know, they kept every single Black newspaper that was ever published during their lifetime, the huge stacks of, you know, original copies of The Crisis and The Guardian and The Negro World and all these, you know, there was a big newspaper published by Black people in Utah that they had in there. So they were very, very, I think that from a very early age, being taught that Black stories were much more robust than even many Black people themselves think when they think of Black history. And, you know, my grandfather used to always say, you know, Black people are everywhere. Even if somebody tells you that, you know, somebody's the first or somebody's the only person in that area, that's not true, just because the history is so vast, and you just have to dig and kind of find those stories. So I definitely think my family kind of guided me through that. And then of course my two favorite professors at BU when I was there. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we have another question, which is, you know, you mentioned that we're back to the book. Yeah. And you mentioned that there are other individuals like Thurman who were part of Trotter's cohort. Were there other women involved in the movement alongside the Brotherhood?
Oh, the African Blood Brotherhood. So Trotter, as I say in the book, was a notorious misogynist, which I believe was one of the reasons, and a good reason, I would say as a woman, why he was so polarizing. However, the women were the ones who fundamentally made sure that newspaper got out. So his wife, Geraldine Trotter, was the one who ran basically the Guardian. You know, Trotter himself was admittedly, he would say himself, a bad business person. So he was not good at collecting the dues that paid for the paper. His wife did all that, his mother, his two sisters. The women who he's connected with the most is Ida B. Wells. She was an early convert to Trotter and a big supporter of his work. And he likewise was a supporter of her work in the Guardian. Also, a woman that many people don't know, as I mentioned in the talk, Henrietta Vinton Davis, who was actually a Black opera singer in Boston in the 1880s and then was converted to Pan-African politics. He was very involved in what he called his National Equal Rights League, and that involved a lot of local women. One of them being a woman named Alice Woodby McCain, who was the first, was a Black woman who ran a hospital in Boston, one of the few Black women-owned hospitals in the country in the 19-teens, and she actually helped publish the Guardian after Trotter's wife died. So he had, in the book, you know, I go into how it is that his misogyny shaped his legacy, and how it was, like, I would argue, and some people would argue, you know, people who are misogynistic, the irony being that their lives are completely being supported and maintained by Black women and the intellectual labor of women. And he definitely fell into that category.
Wonderful. There was another question, actually, that what became of, and we don't want to give too much of the book away, but what became of William Trotter and the Guardian in terms of history?
Okay, so I begin the book with his suicide. Trotter jumped from the roof of his home in Roxbury in 1934 on his 62nd birthday. After years, about, you know, in the midst of the Great Depression, after years of the Guardian declining, as many Black newspapers did with the Great Depression. Trotter, one of the misconceptions I wanted to do with the book was clear up that Trotter did not stop being an activist. He kind of had these multiple high points in his public career, but he continued to be kind of a local and very, very active activist. So up until he died, he was involved in rallies across Boston to support the Scottsboro Boys and support their defense. So one of his last historical records of him is in late 1933, hosting a rally on Boston Common of over 3,000 people demanding that the Scottsboro Boys, who, if you're not familiar, were young men in Scottsboro, Alabama, accused of rape aboard a train and then sentenced to death. He was one of the organizers behind that campaign in New England. So he remained a vital activist. The Guardian itself, and I say this in the book multiple times, if you go back and read it, there's a moment where it starts to decline in quality, even though in terms of what it was saying and trying to do are still revelatory. So, there's misspellings and then there's like double pictures and it's clearly not well edited. I sort of have all these theories of why that was in terms of the book, but so by the time he died, it was really a struggling enterprise. His sister, Maud Trotter Stewart, and her husband continued to publish it. She died in the 1950s, and then that newspaper became and was absorbed by what became the Bay State Banner, which is Black Boston's and Black New England's largest Black newspaper. Many of the young people who worked on the Bay State Banner in the 60s got their start working with the people who were working on the Guardian. So no, the Guardian no longer technically exists, but it's definitely that legacy of Black newspaper production and media in New England and in Boston.
And the Bay State Banner still exists.
Yes, the Bay State Banner still exists. Yep.
Very interesting. Very good. So here's a question just about you and just the idea that you could just take in all of these volumes of books and reading. What are you reading right now outside of your research?
Oh my goodness.
Do you have time to even do that? I don't even know that you might have time to read
outside of my own research. I read, oh my gosh, I read books by my friends because I never get to read books by my friends who are fellow scholars who I went to school with. So my friend Elizabeth Hinton, you probably saw a great spread on her in the New York Times. She has a book called America on Fire, which is fabulous, is great. Annette Gordon-Reed, I've finished her on Juneteenth. I'm really looking forward to this summer getting into some of these big, dense histories. So there's a great new book by Kate Mazur that's all on American politics. But I read a lot of history, and then I then like to like, I don't know, kind of break. I read a lot of classical fiction and literature. So I love William Faulkner. I love Toni Morrison. So I definitely revisit a lot of their texts over and over. I love Shakespeare, so I definitely revisit a lot of their stuff. And definitely, Black women novelists of the 1950s and 1960s. So Anne Petrie, who was a Black woman novelist who I teach a lot at Tufts. So I reread all her stuff all the time. So yeah, I tend to read a lot. I'm one of those people. My mother would always say, read a lot when you're a kid. You read too many books at one time, your brain's gonna explode. And so I read like four books at a time. So I'm always sort of reading.
Amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Well, I just can't describe how grateful we are to have you on our faculty, to have you here with us, and you can say hello to the alumni and the students that are in the audience here. But we just want to say thank you very much for not just your scholarship, but for being here, for your support of the students. We are grateful for this work and just grateful for the time that you can take today to speak with us. Look forward to having everybody get your book and certainly looking forward to the next one. So thank you so much, Dr. Greenidge.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, everybody. I know it's been a challenging year for everybody. So thank you for coming out and have a good summer, everyone.
And I want to thank you all, the attendees, for joining as well. And congratulations to those of you who are celebrating reunion milestones this week. Woohoo! I encourage you to check out an impressive schedule of programming, as I mentioned before, that's scheduled for this week. You can go to go.tufts.edu go.tufts.edu programming. That's go.tufts.edu/reunion programming. And from myself and everyone in the Office of Alumni Relations, thank you so much for joining us. Please be well and take care of yourselves.